Welcome to Small Business, Big Network, the podcast for small business owners who want big results from their networking. I'm Liz Drury, a freelance voiceover artist who knows that if you're not working, then networking could help. Helen Davis is the founder of One Step Forward and a teacher of Bones for Life. Having hated networking when she was in the corporate sector, she was horrified to find she would need to network for her own business. Now, however, she looks at networking as meeting potential friends rather than just pitching her business. Thank you very much for being my guest on the podcast today, Helen.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, you're the founder of One Step Forward, which we will talk about in a minute. And I think the best way to describe you is that you teach people to look after themselves, I would say. But what's your background, Helen? I believe you've come from a corporate background.
That's right. Yes, I did a massive left swerve in my career trajectory over a decade ago now. I spent the first 20 years of my working life as a business analyst working in the media sector. So, which was something I loved. I was good at what I did, but I also knew it wasn't what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I always knew that there was something else out there, but I had no idea how to do it because I didn't think there was anything else I could do.
So what happened next, and how did your career progress?
Well, it didn't actually, because after 20 years, my body told me that it had been shouting at me for long enough, sending me all sorts of signals that things were not right, physically, mentally and emotionally, and I wasn't listening. And so eventually the rug was pulled out from underneath my feet, and in early 2012 I came down with a flu-like virus from which I simply didn't recover. And I was eventually diagnosed with, the official term was post-viral fatigue syndrome, chronic fatigue, something in that field. And pretty much overnight, about 2 weeks before the biggest event of my working year, I was unable to work. I didn't work at all for 18 months. And it took 2.5 years beyond that to start building up to a kind of half-time, I always refer to it as a noddy version of my original job. Basically, I wasn't doing my own job, but I was lucky enough to work for an organisation that supported me throughout. But yeah, it was a really hard, really tough time.
So what were those signs and symptoms that you were ignoring? What do you wish you had listened to now?
There was a real mixture. On the physical side, for years, I'd been getting throat infections every time I got overstressed. And I mean, I've always been someone that didn't want to take antibiotics unless it was absolutely essential. But when one of those kicked in, I knew I had to. And I remember the worst of all was when I was on a trip. Usually my body would cope while I was doing something and the adrenaline was rushing, and it was afterwards I'd collapse. But I was on an extended trip in Asia. I was talking at a conference in Hong Kong, and I got the throat infection, and I literally had to go and find a doctor in Hong Kong and get antibiotics. And I was spending the weekend with a friend I hadn't seen for years, and I basically turned up ill and spent the whole week in bed, and she and her family ended up with my blessing going off and doing all the things she'd arranged for us to do together. So that was a low point. So there were things like that, and then just little niggling things. I'd suffered from migraines since I was 21, and by this point those were chronic, and I was dependent. I didn't realise it at the time, but I was dependent on the migraine drugs, which in turn were causing more headaches. So it was all a bit of a mess. And then the other side was the emotional or mental health side. So I worked very unusually. I worked predominantly from home, and I'd go into the office in London. I ran a team there. Yeah. But I'd go in on a weekly basis. And that meant that when I put the phone down on a phone call, and of course, remember, this is before video calls, it's even before instant messaging. I think that was just about starting. Yeah. So I'd put the phone down on a call, or I'd read an email, and I'd be totally overwhelmed, and I'd go off and have a good cry and go back to my desk and get on with it. But because I was at home, nobody knew that was happening. Whereas if I'd been in the office and popping into the ladies, somebody would have picked up on it. Yeah. And I never asked for help because I just didn't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's quite common, isn't it?
Yeah, it
we
is.
don't like to ask for help. So once you were diagnosed with the chronic fatigue, how did that manifest itself? What kind of symptoms did you have then?
Well, initially, and it didn't last, it was weeks rather than months, but initially I was literally spending 23 hours a day in bed.
Wow.
So it was pretty dramatic. And I mean, I've been a lifelong bookworm. I couldn't read. I couldn't listen to the radio for more than 10 or 15 minutes. I just dozed all day. And then I came out the other side of that. But the physical and emotional and mental fatigue just persisted for a long time. I mean, I had a dog at the time, and it was years before I was able to walk her properly again.
Yeah.
And just having to really learn to pace myself. I remember my doctor once saying, focus your energy on the things you want to do. So spend an hour catching up with a friend who's come to visit rather than emptying the dishwasher. And that was really helpful advice for me. Didn't go down so well in my relationship, but it was what I needed. And because it's really interesting how we can find more energy for the things that light us up.
Yes. Yeah. So how did you go about recovering from that? What did you do for yourself?
Well, the first thing I did was I asked for help. And I did that on a very practical level. I was married at the time, but my husband had actually just gone away on a 6-week business trip when I collapsed.
Oh, no.
So I picked up the phone to my mother, who lived 10 minutes drive away, and she said, I remember lying on the bed just saying, I can't do this anymore. I didn't even know what this was, but I just was saying that aloud. So I rang my mother, and she said, can you get here? As I say, 10-minute drive. And I thought about it and I said no. And she came and picked me up, and she and my stepfather were amazing, and supported me. So that was it. We were starting to ask for help. And then that opened me up to accepting other forms of help that came. And I was referred to a dentist to treat a jaw issue, which was connected to my migraines. And he in turn sent me to a hypnotherapist.
Yeah.
And that's where everything started.
Yeah.
And I worked with this incredible hypnotherapist, Sharon Wax-Kirsch, for a long time. And I also started taking my yoga practice seriously. I used to be the woman who screeched in at 28 and a half minutes past 7. I went, relaxing. Yeah. That was great. What's next?
Yeah.
But once I had enough energy to start attending it, my teacher's teacher led a remedial yoga class, and I joined that. And then, as you know, this is all paving the way for what I went on to do, because I realised very quickly that hypnotherapy was basically what I was meant to be doing.
Yeah.
And I went to my first yoga retreat, and it was mainly because my teacher trained teachers. It was mainly other teachers on the retreat.
Yeah.
And they all said, you need to be teaching.
Yeah.
And I said, don't be ridiculous. I don't bend. And sure enough, I went on to train as both a hypnotherapist and a yoga teacher.
Yeah.
And those two things were the things that saved me. Now, I think in this situation, everyone has to find their own things. I'm not saying that hypnotherapy and yoga are the answer for everybody. They were my answers.
Yeah.
Somebody else's will be something else. The trick is to being open to those things coming into your life and recognising them when they do.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how did you go about then sort of pivoting and starting a new business using what you just learned about yourself, essentially?
Well, this is coming back to what I was saying about how interesting it is that we have more energy available for the things that light us up. So while I was physically, mentally and emotionally unable to do more than a few hours of very, very basic work in my old career from home in a week, at the same time, I found that I was able to go to London and do a week-long training module in hypnotherapy.
Yeah.
And I did that 4 times over the course of a year in 2014 to 15, and then and got my clinical hypnotherapy diploma. And then the following year, I started a 3-year yoga teacher training course. And for all of those, I had the energy. And it sounds like it was very much a choice of doing this rather than doing the paid work. But it wasn't. I literally couldn't do more than a couple of hours of my paid work at the time without having to go back to bed and rest.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. And that's why I knew that this was it. I had to move on.
Yeah.
And that process, because it was such a long time to heal, and because my company was still being supportive, and I was doing work, it's just it wasn't very much. So it took me about 5 years from getting ill to setting up my business. I set up my own business in 2017.
Yeah.
And at that time, it was hypnotherapy and yoga. But as you know, there was another twist to come.
Yes, so tell us about the next thing that happened to you, Helen.
So again, it was a physical health situation. I'm really hoping that my body's shown me what I need to learn. It's in the dramatic ways now, and any future lessons can come with a little bit more calmly.
Yeah.
But it's bizarre, almost exactly a decade after I got ill in early 2022, I had a ridiculous fall at home. I tripped over, I stood on the other leg of my trousers.
Oh.
It was a Sunday evening. Yeah, every woman says, I've done that so many times. And every man goes, what? But yeah, that's what happened. And I was walking too fast through a doorway. So I basically tied my feet together while I was moving. And I crashed to the floor, threw my arms out as we instinctively do.
Yeah.
And I broke both my wrists.
That's so unlucky, isn't it, to break both at the same time?
Just a little bit, yeah. It really was. And I was at home on my own, with the dog. And so just as a very quick aside, I was able to use the skills I know through my clinical hypnotherapy to manage the situation and stop myself going into shock and do all I needed to do to get the help I needed. And then it was, I got taken off, patched up, had surgery on both wrists. Went through that recovery period, incidentally losing my dog at the same time, which was so it was another complete physical, mental, and emotional time when I had to just step back and let everything go for a few months and focus on healing on every level. And I thought that would be the worst thing that happened to me in 2022, but. A few months down the line, being a woman in my 50s who'd broken a bone, or rather two, I was referred for a DEXA scan, a bone density scan, and I was then given the news that the results showed that my bones were in the region of osteoporosis.
Right.
And I was 56 at the time.
Yeah.
As far as I was concerned, I was fitter and healthier than I'd ever been.
Yeah.
I was teaching yoga. It was utterly devastating.
Yeah.
So, bearing in mind my 20-year background in research and analysis, once I'd stopped crying, I picked myself up and I started looking into it. And I discovered this incredible program called Bones for Life, which is based on the Feldenkrais method. And neither of those programs are particularly well known in the UK. They are better well known in a lot of other places in the world. Feldenkrais is kind of the original somatic therapy, movement therapy. And both of them, I always like to describe them as being not muscle training but brain training. It's teaching our bodies to move in a way that they used to move, either in our own childhood or even going back to like ancient patterns of movement, four-legged creatures, amphibians, and all this stuff is still buried deep in our brains. And when we reawaken it, we find a way of moving with ease and comfort and grace that is fantastic. And then what Bones for Life brings in as well is a very conscious intention to incorporate the kind of movement that stimulates bone growth and the postural alignment that has to go hand in hand with that to make sure that we are improving our posture with every step and not worsening it.
Yes. So how long have you been running this program now?
So I discovered it in September 2022, and in January 2023 I joined a 2-year teacher training program with the only person who's training teachers here in the UK. I was incredibly lucky with the timing. Again, it was meant. And as of when we're recording this, I have just completed that 2-year teacher training program, although I've been teaching myself for well over a year at this point.
Oh, congratulations.
Because I was already teaching yoga. Thank you. Thank you. It is a big achievement.
Yeah. So who do you work with and how do you help them?
So the short answer is that anybody who feels I am the right person for them to work with, I am open to working with them. But in terms of who I target, on the hypnotherapy side, I do a lot of work with people who are having surgery, because hypnotherapy is an absolute game changer around surgery. And I work with people with chronic health conditions, helping them do what I did, which is to find this completely new way of looking at life, to encourage and allow the body to find the space it needs to heal. On the Bones for Life side, my primary groups are obviously anybody who has either been diagnosed with osteoporosis or osteopenia, which is like borderline condition of low bone density, or anyone who knows they're at risk. If they've got family members who have had it, it is known to be hereditary. If they've got other reasons that they've been told that their bones may not be as strong as they could be. Yeah. So anyone in that area, basically here's what I do and wants to know more. I'm also really, really passionate about reaching out to women in perimenopause, because I went through menopause at 46. And at that point, it wasn't really on the radar. I did actually know I was going through it, because a very aware acupuncturist had suggested I got tested. At the time, I turned down HRT because I thought it was just about trying to stay young, and just got on with life. Now, if anyone had told me then the stuff that I know now, perhaps I wouldn't have ended up where I did, because I ended up going on to HRT a decade after menopause, because I've learned now about how helpful it is for our bone health.
Right.
Some women can lose up to 20% of bone density in the decade around menopause. Now, obviously, not everybody can take HRT, but an awful lot more people can than used to think they could, because of the way the research has evolved, the products have evolved. And then when you also have this awareness and this understanding of how we need to move. So obviously, most people are aware that weight training is a really good thing to do. Not everyone can do that, and frankly, not everyone wants to. I have always loathed the gym. I still think one day I'll actually start doing it, but it hasn't happened yet. But meanwhile, Bones for Life is giving me a real understanding of what my body needs, how to make my daily walks as effective as possible, and what the little, we call them processes, that I can do in 5 minutes here and there throughout my day to keep supporting my bones, keep supporting my postural alignment, and making sure that I've got the best possible opportunities to live a long and healthy and mobile life, because keeping moving is the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So unless you break a bone and then get tested, how would you know if you had osteoporosis or borderline osteoporosis? Is there any way of knowing?
You don't. No, you absolutely don't. There is no pain associated with it. There is no way of knowing. In terms of breaking bones, obviously what I did, or my mother as well at one point, just slightly overbalanced, standing talking to friends, and landed on a wrist, and her wrist broke. So breaking a bone, and of course the one we're all most aware of, which is the most dangerous, is the hip breaking, because the number of people who don't live more than 5 years after breaking a hip in older age is terrifying. The other thing that can happen if osteoporosis gets severe is spinal fractures, and that's what creates that distinctive hump. Because they call them wedge fractures. So the front of the spinal vertebrae have basically fractured, creating a series of wedges rather than nice level vertebrae stacked on top of each other. And so some people find that they're diagnosed because that has started happening. They've started losing height, and when they have an X-ray, they discover that there have been fractures. Because even those don't necessarily hurt, although they can be painful. But so for all of it, this is absolutely something where prevention is the name of the game, and wherever somebody is, learning what needs to be done to keep our bones growing as much as they can. The official line is that it's not possible to rebuild bone growth, bone density. I have plenty of reasons to believe that that is not true. It may not always be possible for everybody in every situation, but it is not impossible.
So tell me how you work with your clients. Is it in person? Do they need to be in your part of the country to benefit from your expertise?
Absolutely not. I work online and in person. So if people do happen to be in the Hampshire area, which is where I'm based, then fantastic. I have in-person events for my Bones for Life and classic courses, and I see hypnotherapy clients in person. But everything is also online. And in fact, one of the first things I did when I started teaching Bones for Life, I started online because I have a wide network. Relatively few of whom are local to me. And it was so interesting. When I started teaching yoga, it was a question of sticking up posters around the town and hiring a hall. For Bones for Life, I went the other way, and I went big on social media talking about my story, what I'd discovered. And I created an online self-study course so that some people anywhere, not only in the country, but in the world, can sign up to that. And they can do an introductory course. It's about 6 hours long. It's very, very, very competitively priced. Well, not competitively, because there's no one else doing that in this way. But it's very affordably priced to give people an idea as to whether this is something that they want to do. And I've recently launched a membership option as well for those who want a bit of extra support. So we have once a month Zoom classes and also once a month call for support and guidance and connection. So it's very much an on and offline hybrid offer.
Now you mentioned network there, so let's have a chat about networking now. So how do you like to grow your network? What do you do?
I do a lot of networking. I have to be honest, back in the day when I was in the corporate world, I loathed it with an absolute passion. In those days, I was quite, for a long time, I was the only woman at my level in the company I worked for and so on. And networking even just thinking back to then, it sends a shudder down my spine. It was big hotel rooms with a couple of hundred men in suits who all seemed to know each other. And if I'd been speaking at the conference that was normally precipitating it, that was a bit easier because people would at least know who I was. But otherwise, I just wanted to run away. And I always left with an absolute sense of failure. So when I discovered that the way to build my own business was to start networking, I was horrified. But I did start looking into it. And even before COVID, I started discovering the more female-focused networking groups. Not necessarily only women, although I am in a number of those as well, but ones where the focus is making they don't tend to meet at 7 a.m. And it's more like meeting potential friends than trying to pitch your business. And that's how I approach it. And I obviously, like everybody through COVID, the whole online networking took over. And I really like good online networking. I love the networking where you get put into one-to-one or small breakout rooms so you actually meet people. Can't be doing with 60 minutes of 30 pitches.
No.
But where you have the opportunity to meet people and then actually getting to know them. And because when I was going through my recovery from the chronic fatigue and all the rest of it, over that 5-year period, I also got divorced and moved towns. So I found myself
you did a lot, Helen.
Yeah, I did. When I say I changed everything, I changed everything. But so that meant that I found myself in a new town on my own, needing to make new friends and with a business to support, to promote. So networking was how I made my new friends.
Yes.
And all those people only know the person that I am now. And it was a really interesting experience. And so I was able to reinvent myself without having to do anything dramatic because the dramatic stuff had already happened. And just get on with it. And I really enjoy it. I mean, just last week, I met a couple of people who I met through online networking, and I happened to be in their part of the world, and we met up. And it was as if we'd known each other for years.
Yeah.
We met up for lunch,
Yeah.
and I had to tear myself away to go off to my training weekend.
That's lovely. So where do you like to network now? Do you have sort of particular groups that you always go to?
Well, I'm a member of Only, who I'm sure, which is obviously where we met, and
Yes.
I'm sure gets mentioned a lot on this,
Yes.
this pod. I'm also a member, because as I said, I live in Hampshire, so I'm a member of the Crazy Daisy networking group in Hampshire, which is run by Trudy Simmons, which is in person and online.
Yeah.
And I'm a member of the big networking extravaganza, which is also local to this area and predominantly online, predominantly in person, but they've just started adding an online option as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the main ones.
So what do you think would happen to your business if you stopped networking?
I think it would be very hard to continue growing it. I do put a lot of effort into my social media.
Yeah.
And that is starting to get traction these days. But you know, the two go hand in hand. So I went to a new networking meeting. Oh, I've thought of at least two more that I go to, by the way. I went to a new networking meeting the other day, which was a Ladies Who Latte group.
Oh, yeah.
And two of the women in the room said, "Oh, yes, I've heard of Bones for Life. I've heard of you." And that's because they've seen my social media.
Yeah.
And the fact is, I'm the only person in the UK shouting about this stuff on on social media at the moment. So if they've heard of it, that's because of me.
Yes.
But if I hadn't gone to the networking meeting, then we wouldn't have had that conversation, and it might not have gone any further.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the two go hand in hand. I certainly won't be stopping networking anytime soon.
I'm pleased to hear it. So my final question then, Helen, if people want to know more about you or Bones for Life, what is the best way for them to find you?
My website is always a good starting point, which is onestepforward.today. And I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can find me on Facebook as well.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for being my guest. I really enjoyed our conversation and finding out about Bones for Life.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Small Business, Big Network. If you found this podcast useful, please do rate, review and subscribe. And don't forget to share it with the rest of your network too.